Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the return of democracy and the collapse of the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes in Latin America, and the third wave of democratization that cascaded the region in the late 70s and early 80s. And then the context of this return of democracy, the international one and the domestic one, and what accounts for its stability and endurance, and how it coincided with the neoliberal turn, how the Latin American countries actually shifted away from this state-led development model and enacted market-oriented policies, and what kind of outcomes or implications these policies have had for the entire society or the entire political dynamics. So what happened in the late 70s and early 80s? So the military regimes actually handed over power and decided, to return to the barracks and to initiate, these processes of electoral contestation that brought civilians to power. And the breadth and the continuity and the endurance of these regimes made them a bit different from the previous ones, because they didn't witness, this old pattern of interruption between electoral democratic regimes and like social polarization and popular mobilization, and asking, the military to calling upon the military to intervene in order to restore stability and order. So it didn't witness, this old pattern. So it no longer kind of considered as only like swing of pendulum. So that's why it was like a stable wave of democratization that entrenched, the civilian role across the continent. So like in Chile, for example, the old enemies managed to coalesce in order to say no to Pinochet in a plebiscite crafted, like according to the constitution crafted by the dictatorship. So they managed to get together, as I'm going to explain in some detail later. So they managed actually to get together in order to say no to the continuity of the dictatorship regime. That put an end to the dictatorship and ushered in a new era of the concertación, the coalition rule in Chile. In Brazil as well, the military regime initiated or started, this what was called decompression plan, by gradually taking, some measures, some institutional measures to actually to lessen its grip on power and to gradually transfer power to civilians by creating, by kind of relaxing, these kind of harsh legal framework that violated freedom of association, and enabling some like political parties, they actually engineered from or created from above in order to lead or to help with this process of transfer of power to civilians. In Peru as well, the labor mobilization and trade union mobilization pushed for a concrete plan, pushed the military regime to have like a clear schedule regarding transition, and constituting by instituting these constituent assemblies in order to have like a timetable for like the transfer of power from the military regime to civilians, with like some dates, regarding, the elections, the parliamentary and the presidential ones, that actually brought, civilians to power and created somehow representative parliamentary institution. In Argentina as well, the military defeat helped in like creating, different strategic contexts that help like all the enemies as well, like the Peronist and the radical party, that they had this animosity, historical animosity between them, in order to have to form an alliance in order to arrange and coordinate efforts regarding the elections after the withdrawal of the military, in order to initiate, this new civilian democratic regimes. Um, and ever since, it was kind of a stability in these democratic regimes. It didn't witness, this old pattern of instability by like popular mobilization and the intervention of the military. And actually, it was kind of paradoxical that these democratic regimes survived in dire circumstances or conditions. Like economically, for example, Brazil, Argentina, and Peru, the inflation rate actually went far into triple digit. And like it was like huge disparity in income distribution in Brazil. And when it comes to economic performance of the democratic regimes, this kind of performance was not that satisfactory. So despite the fact that these kind of poor economic performance and these kind of social and economic difficult social and economic conditions, the democratic regimes survived in hard times. And even like Guatemala and El Salvador, that witnessed terrified and ruthless military dictatorship and terrifying civil war, they managed to, like all combatants, they managed to get to the negotiation table in order to have an agreement on in order to have peace talks and to have like a agreement for a political settlement. So that actually put an end to all period and a long era of military intervention, guerrilla warfare, and deep-seated social polarization and military governance, or the politicization of the military, and this kind of invitation of the generals to govern and to rule in order to restore stability, in order or to solve the disputes between different political elites. But it doesn't mean like this kind of stability of these of the democratic governance or these democratic regimes. It doesn't mean that they didn't witness some sort of setbacks in different sense. Although like they didn't witness like actual breakdown as it happened before, but there had been some manifestations of democratic deficits or some sort of drawbacks. By highlighting, some issues regarding like drug trafficking, crime rates, again, like social and economic performance, income inequality, unfair distribution of income or economic resources. So although it didn't like the stability, it lasted until late 90s, and perhaps like at the turn of or until like 2005, with what's called like when the leftist parties actually assumed power and led to what was called the left turn in Latin America or in the region. So it was like kind of stability with some sort of setback, but stability doesn't mean or doesn't entail that there have been like quality of representation, like citizens were totally satisfied with the performance of the new democratic regime. So there was some sort of difficulties, and these regimes actually survived these difficulties, comparing these conditions to the previous ones. So the regimes actually survived these social and economic difficulties. But eventually, when we see this in a more dynamic term, so you can see like stability for some time and different, like the elimination of the old pattern of regime breakdown or democratic breakdown. But another sort of problems did surface, and this gave rise to what's called neo-populism or neo-populist leaders or outsiders to campaign on elitist or anti-establishment platform that actually they actually reach power through the same electoral dynamics or electoral contestations. So, as Mainwaring and Hagobian actually argued, so when you have to analytically separate, the conditions that give way to the return of democracy or the emergence of the new democratic regimes, and the capacity or what they call solidity of these regimes, and the capacity to actually to stand or to survive in hard times, and to immune themselves, to any sort of breakdown or exogenous crisis that would lead to erosion and regime breakdown. So they are kind of analytically distinct, and you have to analytically highlight what kind of conditions that give rise or that enable these democratic regimes to emerge in the first place, and then what kind of factors or conditions that actually help them to stabilize or to harness their capacity in order to stand or to survive difficult situations, and to fend off any kind of challenges that would lead to their collapse or erosion. So what was striking with the new wave of, or the third wave of democratization, that the wave ran against, the conventional explanations of democratic or regime survival. So unlike modernization theory, so according to this theory, one of the prerequisite in order to have like democratic regime in the first place, you have to have like some sort of level of economic development. But again, like the relationship between this level of development and democratic survival or regime survival in Latin America, for a long period of time, this relationship, has been indeterminate. So the newly emerging democratic regimes survived these harsh social and economic conditions, and they actually emerged in harsh economic conditions, or in some places, economic hyperinflation crisis and debt crisis, and class approach as well. For more like no bourgeoisie, no democracy, and for Ruschemeyer and Huber and Stefan, they actually mentioned the role of the working class in order to stimulate or to push for democratic governance. These regimes actually like the emergence of the return of democracy, or the emergence of this newly democratic regimes after the third wave didn't like neatly fit into this class category or class approach. It's not like that applicable to them. For like in Bolivia, El Salvador, Guatemala, for example, like democracy emerged in unfavorable conditions with some business groups or business enterprises that actually supported, and they had like history of support for military and authoritarian leaders. And for working class, the flip side of this, like the favorable condition with the popular mobilization and the workers' mobilization led to the collapse of the democratic regime in Chile and Uruguay in 1973, and in Argentina several times in 63, 66, and then 76. So when it comes to class approach, like democracy actually emerged and thrived, in conditions, in less in unfavorable conditions, in unfavorable kind of class structure that would have actually eliminated, this social or class basis of democratic governance. And when it comes to this performance-based argument, like for any particular democratic regime to survive, like the political elites or ruling circle had to safeguard or to guarantee some sort of good economic performance. But that actually, again, it didn't happen. Like in Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru, like the inflation crisis and the economic crisis hit hard, and despite of these kind of crises, democratic regimes that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s managed to endure and to like to immune themselves from to any kind of regime breakdown. So what's puzzling about that was that like democracy emerged in like within unfavorable cultural structural conditions, and the flip side of the argument that the favorable conditions that would have enabled democracy or democratic regimes to endure or to stabilize themselves in the 60s and 70s, it actually didn't help them to survive, and led to the collapse of the democratic regimes and the installation of the bureaucratic authoritarian or the military authoritarian regimes. So what kind of theoretical lens or foundation that would help us understand what happened in Latin America when it comes to the emergence or the return of democracy? This, like, the transitory moment. What helped, with the emergence of the newly democratic regime? So the international environment was quite favorable. As I mentioned last lecture, like starting from like late 80s and or throughout the 80s, actually, like the United States, actually, they developed, different kind of discourse of democracy promotion, and the administration, or one of the main pillar of the foreign policy in Latin America, ceased to favor, this direct or physical military intervention. So it was like favorable international environment, and actually with the end of the Cold War as well. So it was like favorable circumstances, or much more conducive when it comes to the international support for democratic rulers. And to this actually helped the American administration to denounce the military dictators and the violation of human rights that actually eroded, the legitimate basis of these regimes. So internationally, or the international environment or the global context actually stimulated or like gave kind of push for internal dynamics to install or to re-establish democratic governance in Latin America. Domestically, elite attitudes as well. So political elites that actually engineered or negotiated transition, they had different kind of attitudes or commitment to democratic values. So after having experienced this kind of traumatic experience of authoritarian rules, they became much more like they appreciated more the democratic rule, or the freedom of association and freedom of expression. So political elites strategically like they became kind of committed to democratic values or democratic regime, and to get integrated into this electoral contestation, because they might have a chance in they stand chance to reach power in future elections, even if they lose, like in the time, like in the moment, or at a particular moment. So they might still have a chance to reach power, or to and to implement their policy programs after winning, electoral contestation. So strategically, in some countries, political elites, actually, as I mentioned in the beginning, like old enemies managed to get together, and they forged, kind of a strategic coalition, and they formed strategic alliance in order to offset or to mitigate, the influence of conservative, like the conservative elements or conservative blocs or radicals that would block the transition process. So in Chile, for example, the Social Democratic Party that supported the military and actually applauded, the military intervention in order to put an end to Allende's government. They actually approached the socialist in order to and became part of the Concertación, the coalition of the center left, in order to arrange effort or to collect, or to maximize their chance to say no to Pinochet. similarly, like the radicals and the Peronists in Argentina, they learned from their past mistakes, and for the first time, the radicals, voted or won the elections after the withdrawal of the military, and they formed, the alliance in order to have, like, to arrange, what kind of um, steps, they would take in order to maintain, this, to neutralize, the military, and to maintain, this democratic momentum. Um, so strategically, political elites in some countries, they formed, this kind of alliance with old rivals or old enemies in order to counterweight or to balance out, to tell the balance of power, to in favor of them. And in other countries, like they capitalized on this kind of elite divisions or factions within, like, the military regimes or the old incumbents, that they disagreed over the pace of transition, or the pace at which, they transfer, they should transfer power. So that's why they capitalized on this kind of fraction by approaching, by having kind of a pact with the military ruler in order to stabilize the entire system. For example, like the Colorado, the two traditional parties in Uruguay, they had like kind of negotiation with the military in order to de-radicalize the political landscape, and to decide on the presidential candidate that would gather, would acquire kind of consensus from all political forces, and would prevent, this kind of traditional or old political polarization between different social and political forces. And relatedly, these kind of elite attitudes, strategic behavior, as Schmitter and O'Donnell mentioned, this kind of strategic behavior and commitment to democratic values, it had like some sort of ideational underpinnings as well. As Kenneth Roberts mentioned about how, like, leftist parties and leftist leaders, they went through this kind of revisionist process in order to reflect on their past experience and what led to the collapse of the democratic regime, and gave way to this kind of harsh military regimes, or give way to the military junta to establish, their to have this iron fist on power. He referred to, and basically this actually applies to Chile and Peru. And while it managed, like the leftist forces managed, to go through this learning process and to have this, what Garreton mentioned, socialist renovation, that actually they were open to some sort of ideological innovation and new ideas that motivated or directed and guided their political behavior and their action. While they managed to do that in Chile, they failed, to go through the same like process of reflection and self criticism in order to reach, that point, in order to unify effort and to get integrated into this kind of electoral contestation, and to redefine democracy differently within the main parameter of the liberal paradigm, while pushing for more social and economic rights as well. So according to this kind of ideational element of the socialist renovation thing that happened mainly like with some leftist forces in Latin America and mainly in Chile, so they actually abandoned, this kind of theoretical foundation of this Marxist-Leninist approach. Although, like, it lost, like, this kind of Marxist-Leninist theories, the theories actually lost traction in Europe with the advance of, like, social democratic framework. It didn't, like, in the late 50s and 60s. It didn't resonate with the Latin American context because of the revolution in Cuba that actually gave a boost to guerrilla movements and to more kind of believe in this kind of violent tactics and popular sovereignty, how to actually to have or to believe like firmly in these revolutionary ideas, and to capture or to conquer, power centers through revolutionary and violent acts in order to have this full commitment to implementation of the socialist development model. So what happened, like after the traumatic experience of the authoritarian regimes in Latin America in the late 60s, especially, like it's a process of learning, like these regimes actually lasted for roughly 2 decades. So this kind of traumatic authoritarian experience gave way or gave space for leftist forces to reflect, especially when they were forced into exile. So they had some sort of interaction with the left in Europe. So they learned somehow from these kind of revisions of leftist revisions in Europe, and they kind of exported or transplanted, the same kind of revisionist model in Latin America, or in their own way to do politics in their own context. And this kind of series of guerrilla defeats as well, it helped, with these kind of revisions and self-critique, how like these kind of old tools or traditional tools were kind of they were not that beneficial, and they didn't actually help like leftist forces although they helped like some leftist forces to reach power, but they didn't help with the consolidation of their power or the advancement of their socialist program. And the economic crisis that hit hard as well, it helped them to revise the basic elements of socialist models. Now, like this kind of fiscal constraints and the hyperinflation crisis, like the budget deficit, or the balance of power, the balance of payment, the deficit of the balance of payment, and this kind of this kind of economic crisis discredited, this old model of state-led growth, or like the big role or the main role of the state in planning and regulating economic activities. So they no longer, have this belief in socialism as the panacea for all the economic and social problems. So they had to adapt or to adjust somehow to the new global context, and the prescriptions of international financial institutions for enactment of market-oriented measures. So that was like, it helped them to to revise, the main pillars or of socialism, economically and politically, and they developed kind of new democratic ethos that they are based mainly on this conception of political participation and equality, how to push for some sort of economic and political equality, and to help in eliminating any kind of exploitative structure without believing in these kind of revolutionary means. They can do that by reaching power and implementing some sort of public policies that eliminate, these, or address, these kind of social and economic inequalities. And it's more related to the like Gramsci notion of war of position. It's more about how to establish some sort, to gain some autonomous political space in society or in civil society, in order to have their own ideas, in order to attract or to appeal to new social constituents, without playing any kind of vanguard, without being like a vanguardist, party or something like that. So they allow for some autonomous space for political action and for new actors, to join in, without having, this kind of believing in this vanguard parties, or their role in leading, society, or in this kind of stimulating and deepening these kind of popular sovereignty. But this kind of political learning, it's not like it's not like automatic process, like these kind of like guerrilla defeat, traumatic experience, like in Peru, like the same political forces, or like the same with the same like ideological predispositions, they actually went through the same like traumatic experience, but the political learning and the strategic context, were a little bit different. So the actually like leftist parties, they didn't agree, or they didn't reach any sort of consensus among them in order to reduce, the entire process to this kind of electoral procedures, or this kind of minimal definition of democracy. But they were deeply like ingrained in this idea of popular sovereignty, and how to use, the like violence and like insurgencies in order to achieve political goal. So how to they did believe in this kind of aggregation of different popular identities in order to have one coherent or cohesive collective identity that would represent, these popular sovereignty, or the popular identity that actually quite representative of the people. So for Roberts, he mentioned something like this kind of political learning is kind of it's highly contested, and it's inherently like political and conflictual. So it's not like a direct response or automatic or mechanical response to past experiences. It had more to do with the party organizations, with how the socialists and Christian Democrats, the socialists, after going through this kind of political learning and socialist revisions, they actually approached, or they decided, to forge an alliance with the the Christian Democratic Party, and actually excluded communists and radicals and extremists from this political bargain or political settlement. So it had more to do with the party organization and the decision making, the internal organization, and the structure of decision making inside the Socialist Party. It was kind of decentralization of power that offered some space for deliberation and debates. So this like made the party, or like this kind of organizational structure, much more open to external influences. So they had to receive they were quite recipient, or they welcomed, some sort of new ideas in order to process, thoroughly, or to deliberate, to have like discussions and debates and deliberations about it openly. And then they had like to kind of to appeal to or to reach beyond their traditional electoral constituencies in order to appeal to new political actors. So this made them much more. This made the party much more appealing to new political actors or social actors, and they decided actually to leave out, the extremists. And this like made the party much more, as I mentioned, open to ideological ideational innovation, and this helped in directing and guiding, political action and political behavior. So that was quite successful in Chile in this kind of transitory moment, while it was like it failed miserably in Peru because of this kind of belief in what Roberts mentioned, deepening democracy and forging, this kind of popular sovereignty or popular identity in order to push for like more social and economic equality. So it's not like reducible. Democracy is not reducible to these political procedures. Democracy has to reach beyond in order to include some social and economic elements. So when it comes to like emergence of that account for like a kind of stabilization, and was kind of consequential for the stability of the newly emerging democratic regime after the third wave in several countries, and it was quite consequential for the entire party system and the political dynamics in Peru, as we're going to see shortly. So so they managed, to in Peru, like, to be sure, they managed, to these kind of social mobilization. They had like highly organized or mobilizable trade unions from Velasco that enabled, this kind of as a military dictator, he enabled, or he offered some space for these popular forces to mobilize and to organize, and they used, these kind of organizational assets in order to put an end to military rule and to establish or to pave the way for civilian government. But the entire political dynamics and the stability of the newly emerging regimes was quite vulnerable because of this kind of a volatility in party system and the lack of a consensus or coherence between different political actors, different ideological political actors, and let alone even like the internal divisions within the same ideological camp, like the crisis of the left in Peru. So that when it comes to like the emergence of these regimes, like the attitudes of the new political elites and the strategic bargaining within like more favorable international context, these variables or these factors were much more or were decisive in putting an end to the military rule and the establishment or the installation of the new democratic governance. But the stability of or the endurance of these democratic regimes, in order to investigate, the scope conditions or the conditions under which, these regimes actually managed to sustain or to endure over time, and to have like, some sort of immunity, to collapse or regime breakdown, you have to investigate or to look into some structural factors. These kind of economic and regime performance, like social and economic factors, are crucial here, and mass attitudes as well towards democracy. Because like the popular or the mass tolerance towards some economic and social problems, actually the tolerance varies across different countries. So while in some countries like citizens, they decided, to give another chance for the existing political elites or like the traditional political establishment. In other countries, they actually rejected it altogether and gave way to the rise of political outsider, or led to the collapse of the entire party system. For example, in Venezuela, from the late 80s, in 1989, this kind of like the introduction or like introducing these neoliberal economic measures, I'm coming to this shortly, led to like division inside the Action Democratic Party, that the party didn't support, the president with his initiative or policy initiative to implement this market-oriented reform. And slowly, in a decade, actually, it led to the total collapse of the two-party system. The two traditional parties lost, their traditional electoral constituencies, like the Christian Democratic Party and the Democratic Action Party, and this gave way to Chavez, his populist discourse to establish or to entrench his power, and to actually to campaign on anti-establishment platform. And to deinstitutionalize the entire political system. So like Venezuela was like the least likely case to have this kind of democratic collapse, because it had like this tradition of open political system and some degree of political competitiveness, and these kind of two traditional entrenched or well-established two-party system. But actually, as we're going to see like when we address the issue of rentier resources and the role of oil, so we'll see like how like mass attitudes and the regime performance as well were crucial when it comes to like explaining the collapse of the two-party system and the erosion of the democratic governance and the rise of political outsider in Venezuela. In Argentina, for example, they witnessed, some sort like dissatisfied masses. They took to the street in order to vocalize or to voice their opposition to the existing political elites, especially that led to like the collapse or the end of the mandate of De La Rua, for example, before the end of his mandate. But what happened, like the party system managed actually to retain some sort of balance by like the Peronist party managed to reach beyond its core or traditional constituencies and attracted, some or appealed to some new emerging and new progressive forces and accommodated some of their demands especially with the rise of Kirchner in order to renovate, the Peronist appeal to the masses, and actually managed to stabilize. Despite the slow erosion that led to the disappearance of the Radical Party, for example, but the Peronists managed to re-equilibrate the entire party system. So mass attitudes and performance kind of interacted in a way that would account for the stability of the entire system and the degree of immunity to exogenous shock or like entire breakdown from within. What happened in Peru, it was like, continuation of this kind of elite disputes and like ideological divisions and organizational sectarianism between different political parties. So Peru as well witnessed like the emergence of new political outsider, Fujimori. He actually capitalized on the crisis of leftist parties in Peru. So in the 80s, like if you remember, like, Aprista or the Aprista party, it had like the party had this tradition of political opportunism and this kind of ideological deviation. So it depends on the situation. So the party didn't like project, this kind of coherent ideological position. So it depended on the situation. So what happened, it was like with the Popular Action Party as like a conservative one, people like became widely dissatisfied, with the economic policies, and this gave way to Aprista, or mainly Garcia from Aprista, to renovate or to reestablish, kind of a partisan position within the political landscape. So he assumed power and promised, to address the social and economic issues. But what happened, like the Aprista and the Action, the Popular Action Party, they actually they didn't manage to offer any kind of remedy or solution for a social and economic crisis. And the United Left, IU, they would have like this kind of united left, strategically would have capitalized on the existing crisis in order to establish kind of a hegemonic position in the political landscape. But it again failed because of the internal division between moderates and radicals. And they actually disagreed, or they disputed over whether or not to form an alliance with Aprista within a context of the rising tide of shining path as insurgency movement. This actually committed, the group actually committed like several crimes and terrorist attacks against civilians. So the political stand, or the situation within the leftist parties towards, or especially the United Left, towards the shining path, was kind of confusing, because some of them, they considered the movement, they feel they related in a way or another to the same means of doing politics. Like they did believe that the move, or the insurgency or the guerrilla could be part of the popular camp because it believed in this kind of violent means and like popular sovereignty and the rights of peasants to use violence in order to advance their political goals or their economic demands. And on the other side, or on the other hand, some people or a faction inside the United Left, they disagreed, or they remained kind of repugnant, and they didn't like the way the Shining Path actually committed, terrorist attack and isolated some social and political forces, because Shining Path actually appealed to some popular forces, but it actually, after gaining some sort of support from trade unionists or labor movement, it actually cracked down or turned against them, because they didn't believe in any sort of autonomous social space that would serve as a bulwark against their insurgency action, or it actually terrorist actions against civilian targets. So this kind of disputes inside the United Left, it's kind of a continuation or extension of the same old pattern of these kind of ideological disputes that actually pushed citizens and wide masses to become like disillusioned with the existing political establishment. And this paved the way for political outsider to depict himself as like a one related to a common people, and the one like projecting a kind of image as a political candidate that actually that did hover over these kind of partisan disputes, and cultivating this image of or populist image as a one from people, and he actually did care about solving their problems. So he attracted wide masses and popular sectors, especially from shantytown dwellers and subaltern groups that actually gave or that actually did throw their lot behind Fujimori. And this led to the entire collapse of the party system. And the traditional parties like the IUAP, the Populist Action Party, and the Prista and the United Left actually didn't gain like more than 5% in the early 80s elections that actually brought an outsider to power. So like the mass attitudes and regime performance and structural factors were crucial in order to understand the stability and the consolidation, to what extent the newly democratic regime managed to consolidate their power. So the context as well, like these like civilian leaders or like civilian regimes actually installed like their new way of governance or new democratic rules within a context of economic crisis that actually hit hard the entire region in the 80s. So the failure of the import substitution industrialization, as I mentioned 2 weeks before, and this kind of the gap between like the imports and exports and foreign the heavy foreign borrowing, and like led to like the debt crisis and failure to pay the debt service. So the entire country, except for Chile, that actually initiated the policies of market of neoliberalism or market-oriented policies under Pinochet in the 70s. So all the countries in the 80s, they had to follow the prescription of Washington Consensus, meaning to reduce the state size or the public bureaucracy size in order to diminish the role of the state in planning and regulating economic activities, and to give some space for private enterprises and business people and market forces in order to work and leave like the market mechanisms to correct for any sort of failure or any kind of problem. And this required some sort of elimination of constraints and restrictions on trade, like how to liberalize trade by eliminating, these kind of protective tariffs, and to make, the labor market much more flexible, and to leave it to the supply and demand sides, and to sell off, the public enterprises to undertake, these privatization measures in order to have to let private sector to have some sort of market share, and to stimulate economic, to leave these competition and market forces to stimulate economic growth, instead of some sort of policy intervention or status status regulations that previously were in charge of stimulating growth and stimulating economic and social development. So the state actually had limited space or limited latitude over economic decision-making process by integrating, into, or allowing for more integration into the global market, and giving space for private enterprises or business people to run economic affairs. So and these had to, the state now had to roll back on their kind of redistributive and far-reaching redistributive economic measures. Didn't have any kind of enough material and fiscal resources in order to implement far-reaching social and economic programs, like to pay increase or to guarantee these kind of insurance and security for workers, or to have some subsidies for peasants and popular sectors. So now the state had to reduce these kind of public spendings in order to overcome or to have this kind of economic recovery by following, the prescription of the international financial institutions. So, this kind of the top processes of economic trend, democratic transition and the neoliberal turn, they actually went hand in hand. So, what we are trying to explain here, how these newly emerging or new political leaders that actually assume power managed to implement these drastic market reform measures that by definition would have stimulated some sort of popular resistance or wide mass protest. So how come did they manage to implement these policies and to fortify or to consolidate their power position, and to actually eliminate or to fend off any sort of popular resistance against their policies? So we have different interpretations or different explanations about how these policies actually were implemented or were enacted, and then we will have so we investigate the reasons or the processes by which these political or economic liberalization measures were enacted, and then the implications of these policies for political dynamics and the quality of democratic governance. And this will be the topic over the next 3 weeks. The quality of democracy, the endurance or stability of democracy doesn't mean that you have a quality of representation, that you have significant political participation, that you have citizens, they perceive their democratic governments as fully responsible or accountable and responsive to their demands. Otherwise, we shouldn't have witnessed this kind of neo-populism in the region. So in a way, this is one manifestation. So for the justifications or the reasons behind the implementation or the dynamics by which political leaders manage to implement or to enact these policies. So we have 3 trends, in the existing literature. So one, like Roberts, focus on, how populist leaders actually appeal to, they renovated in a way new populist discourse in order to appeal to the wide masses, with this, populism at the micro level, and maintaining, this technocratic decision-making, economic decision-making processes. So political leaders managed to push through economic or drastic reform measures. And then Weiland offered like another like psychological and cognitive explanations by focusing on the psychology of decision-making process, and making distinction between different domains of losses and gains, and how they would affect, this kind of shift of domains would push political leaders to take or to seek some risks, or to avoid or to averse, risky decisions by implementing these kind of radical and painful austerity measures and stabilization and deregulation measures. And then Shams actually focused on the politics of undertaking or enacting these reform measures by looking into the social and economic coalition, or the foundation, shifting, the coalition from socioeconomic foundation, shifting the coalition that pushed for import substitution, industrialization, and now like the state shifted, these distributional coalition in order to win over, the business groups or business associations by offering, some sort of rents and benefits in order to push for these economic liberalization measures. So we start out with populist explanation. So at first glance, it might sound as kind of an oxymoron to speak of like neoliberal populism. And that actually, it emanates from basically the old definition, or the traditional definition of populism, that actually emerged within, this era or the context of import substitution industrialization. So these populist leaders actually like they had some sort of fiscal autonomy and some sort of economic resources in order to implement far-reaching, redistributive, and expansionist economic and social policies. So in order to attract or to cultivate support of the popular masses, so they had to dangle out, some material benefits, some far-reaching, material benefits by raising, wages, or offering, some subsidies and some sort of like expansionist, policies in building, infrastructure and some sort of public good provisions. So they had like enough material resources in order to implement these policies. And also they had, this kind of social and political coalition with popular classes and most especially labor movement that actually served as like bastion for the populist regimes. And then with some sort of varying degrees, as I mentioned in week 2, they focus mainly on mobilization from above, how to control, their the trade unions or the labor confederations and peasants, cooperatives, in order to just to mobilize them for some sort of political reason, with different degrees that they varied, from one country or one context to another, as revised, the second week, when we talked about, Collier and Collier. So with the neoliberal turn that actually, by definition, asked the state or reduced the size of the state and limited, these kind of fiscal resources available for them in order to implement, these expansionist and social and far-reaching social spending. They no longer had, these kind of economic resources in order to commit to these social and economic programs. And they had actually to demobilize, popular sectors, and especially labor, and they had to atomize, these kind of corporatist arrangements and organizations in order to avoid any sort of collective action against the new economic measures. Um, and the like this kind of division, or projecting, this image of popular sovereignty, or having, this kind of referenda or plebiscites in order to represent, or to as a manifestation of the popular will against, this form of electoral liberal representation or representative model, no longer served them, because it would have destabilized the political system. So it might seem like, there are some contradictions when we talk about this neoliberal turn and populist politics, because economically they didn't have enough resources to commit to wide social spending. They had to demobilize old traditional popular sector in order to proceed with these new or drastic neoliberal measures, and they had to somehow to control, or to have like control over popular and social mobilization, by mitigating or tuning out, this kind of popular sovereignty discourse, and focusing mainly on these electoral and regular electoral contestations as the only way to assume power. But again, like Roberts and Violent mentioned that there is close affinity between like populism and neoliberal regimes or neoliberal policies. The actually, if you perceive this in a more, not in a static, but in a more as a dynamic process, so you can examine how neo-populist forms, or non-traditional forms of populism emerged within the context of neoliberal market policies. So what happened? Like traditional political parties, they did recast their relationship, or actually they broke with this, re-established their links to trade unions and labor movements, but at the same time they re-established in a way as a kind of adjustment strategy. So they had to re-establish, the linkage to social groups or social constituents on clientelistic basis. So narrow basis of targeted or selective benefits, or more like, a large scale clientelistic network. This would cultivate, some sort of um, like a close relationship or links with the existing political leader, or like populist leader, and some local provinces or some local areas. So it was kind of building blocks for local support, or at the local levels or subnational levels. So he had like some local brokers or patrons in order to distribute some material benefits, some like selective benefits, especially in areas that would represent or challenge or or a threat, to the existing regime. And of course, they de-linked or they de-institutionalized, their corporatist relationship or arrangement with political parties or trade unions, but they appeal to they became widely disorganized anyhow because of this privatization measures that led to like extensive layoffs and fell off of this unionist or unionization or membership in trade unions. So they became kind of atomized, and most of them, they were forced into informal sector. So the new populist leaders, they had now like new disorganized or atomized, fragmented informal sector or subaltern groups. So the appeal to, in order to attract their or the populist discourse actually resonated, with the living conditions of these sectors. They formed somehow a coalition with these groups, and they actually relied heavily on this anti-elitist and anti-establishment ideology in order to attract, these the support of the popular masses. So the where these sectors, despite disorganized and fragmented, they became like widely disillusioned, with the existing political establishment and political parties, that made them vulnerable to, or much more like open to any kind of populist appeal. And still like embedding these popular classes or popular groups into personalistic and paternalistic relationship, is still like political leadership, they appeal to them, and he like the political leadership, the populist leadership, offer this kind of personalistic leadership to offer some sort of guidance to the multi-class coalition or alliance. And they used this top-down approach of mobilization as well, in order to entrench their power, or to have to cultivate social support in the face of, or on their confrontation with, what they call old establishment, or oligarchical domination, especially in Venezuela and Peru. Um, so how these populist leaders managed to to implement, or to proceed, or to move ahead, with these neoliberal measures, despite the fact that these measures, or austerity measures and painful economic measures, would have stirred up some sort of political and social resistance from marginalized sectors, or mainly kind of losers, because of the high social cost of these policies. So as I mentioned, Fujimori, like uh, the context, that helped him to appeal, or helped his populist discourse to thrive. It was mainly the crisis of the leftist parties, so that he managed actually to portray himself, or to project an image of um, self-made man, by focusing mainly on this individualistic and personal qualities. He actually he did feed into this atomization and fragmentation, and prevented any sort of collective action from emerging. So he basically focused on some sort of personal values, by self-reliance, efficiency, hard working, these kind of that enabled him to have to secure his political position, rather than this kind of forming this collective identity and popular sovereignty one. So focusing on these kind of personal qualities as one that actually related to common people, on the one hand, and when untainted, or he didn't have this distorted image, by as one from outside of the existing political parties or existing political establishment. So he had his anti-establishment and anti-elitist and anti-oligarchical discourse was actually somehow credible and reliable. So he increased his credential as an outsider, or his attack on the existing political establishment, because they failed to address social and economic problems, and they failed to offer a solution for shining path or terrorist attacks on civilians. So his discourse was mainly focused mainly on his personal traits, his personal features or characteristics on the one hand, and anti-establishment element on the other hand, in order to discredit the existing political elites. But he didn't he made these kind of vague promises. He didn't have clear-cut promises or political platform how to address the social and economic problems and the economic crisis. So he gave himself a space, to campaign on this populist discourse. And after reaching power, he implemented, the conservative or the neoliberal economic measures. And when he feel his movement Cambio 90, he worked on deinstitutionalizing. He actually focused on personalization of power rather than establishing solid partisan identification. So that's why he didn't even, rely on his Cambio 90 after reaching power. And when he faced some sort of institutional opposition or institutional accountability from the parliament, he closed the parliament in 1991, what was called auto golpe. He closed the parliament in order to eliminate any sort of political opposition to his economic and to his policies, generally speaking. And what helped him, the entire collapse of the party system, the traditional parties that existed, at the turn of the 20th century, totally disappeared in the early 90s. And he actually, as I mentioned, together with this anti-populist or anti-establishment and anti-elitist discourse, in order to attract or to appeal to popular and subaltern classes, he actually focused, or he actually implemented, this selective targeting policies by transferring some fund for social emergency funding as well, in order to offer some sort of public goods like nutrition, sanitation, or like education, transportation, infrastructure in different local areas. And he actually made like generous funding through the social relief program for poverty alleviation. It was like national fund for compensation and desarrollo and development in 1991, in order to actually to alleviate poverty and to offer some sort of social services, especially in needy areas. So through this kind of populist discourse or populist funding, and some sort of limited in a way, if you compare this to the populist era, he managed to cultivate, or to sustain or to perpetuate, this populist discourse. And what actually helped or did feed off, the crisis, the existence or the failure or the complete failure of the existing oligarchical political class, helped him to have or to turn, the discourse as a war between him or as a populist leader and the existing political class. So it actually it helped him to eliminate, these old forces and to entrench his populist discourse, and then to move or to proceed with this neoliberal economic measures. And then like privatization offered some sort of more financial resources to the state that actually helped with the economic recovery. Like the two main examples like of populist leaders that actually campaigned or offered some sort of vague promises in their electoral campaigns in order to address economic crisis, and then after reaching power implemented, these social and these neoliberal economic measures. It happened in Peru, and then in Argentina with Carlos Menem. Menem actually from the Peronist party that had like this long established and well entrenched relationship with the labor movement and trade unions. He actually broke or managed to recast the relationship with the Peronist and the labor or the trade unions and the labor unions by offering, some sort of clientelistic or selective benefits in some local provinces, and by co-opting or the top leadership or top personnel in the political parties that actually managed to break, their ties with trade unions. So he actually offered, some space, for party leaders in Congress in order to to have a say or to veto, some political. He offered some sort of policy concessions in order to get, some sort of support from party leaders in Congress to pass or to promulgate, these public policies, economic policies. And he actually shifted, the coalition from these traditional political actors or traditional labor unions, trade unions, to Authaid. It's a political party known for its support for business associations and like liberal economic measures. And he actually appointed some economic figures or from private firms. He like some economic figures. They gained some sort of political position in his cabinet. So it was like quite clear and quite obvious that he, like LaAm, actually shifted, the coalition or the social economic foundation from traditional or popular movements to business associations and business groups. And this actually what helped him. He made some sort of approachment to these business firms or private firms that have that actually have some international connections, and he got some support from the military establishment as well in order to mitigate, any kind of political and popular and social resistance, either from his own party or from a social sphere or a social landscape. So I leave it there, and next lecture we will continue with the sociological explanation and cognitive explanation of the implementation of these policies, and like the politics of forming, new economic and social coalitions, and then the repercussions and implications for this policy for the quality of democratic governance and the participation and representation. Okay, bye.